October 4th, 1957. At Vandenberg Air Force Base, twilight falls over hangars and empty parking lots. Inside the officers' mess, the air smells of reheated coffee and damp paperwork. 3 uniformed men speak in low voices about the upcoming Vanguard program test launch. Outside, the Pacific roars with the calm of a windless night. Suddenly, at the back table, a weather technician adjusts the dial of a small radio receiver. A sharp, regular beeping slips through the static. At first, no one pays any attention. It sounds like the echo of a badly tuned transmission, a metallic heartbeat repeating every second. But the young engineer frowns and raises his voice. "Gentlemen, listen to this." The officers glare at him, annoyed by the interruption. The sound continues. Beep, beep, beep. One of them leans toward the radio. "Turn that thing off," he says, half joking. "It sounds like a teletype with asthma." The technician shakes his head. "It isn't interference, sir. It's a signal, a continuous transmission." The eldest of the 3 sets his fork down on his plate. "Where is it coming from?" "From the sky," the young man answers. Silence. Only the beeping keeps filling the air. In the next room, a communications operator rushes in with a memo in his hand. "A press bulletin just came in from Washington. The Soviet Union has launched something. A satellite, sir." The word drops like a stone. Satellite. No one moves, no one speaks. The tallest officer, sleeves rolled and face weathered, repeats slowly, as if the phrase itself were absurd. "A Soviet satellite?" The engineer nods. "It's in orbit. Stations in Turkey and Germany confirmed it." "What's it transmitting?" "Just that beeping." "And what does it mean?" "It means it works." The silence that follows is not admiration, but disbelief. In the years after the war, the United States had grown used to being first in everything: the bomb, the jet, the radar, computing. And now, the first human-made object in space carried a red flag. The colonel rests both hands on the table, slowly. "Since when can the Russians launch something that doesn't fall down?" The young engineer meets his eyes without raising his voice. "Since today." The radio keeps emitting its metallic signal, steady, hypnotic. Beep, beep, beep. Outside, the sky is clear, and above the Pacific coast, a faint light crosses the darkness. It is a metal sphere, barely 80 centimeters in diameter, reflecting sunlight as it circles the planet. The men in the room cannot see it. They can only hear it. A beeping that comes from space, traveling over their heads, repeating the news that no politician or general had wanted to hear. In that sound, so simple, so innocent, beats the announcement of a new era. The sky no longer belongs to anyone. Sputnik's beeping continues, regular, unending, like humanity's first mechanical heart. Between 1955 and 1957, the United States still lived wrapped in the technical glory of its victory in the Second World War. The nation's laboratories were the temples of modern science. In Los Alamos, physicists had mastered atomic fire. At Boeing and Lockheed, engineers had pushed aviation beyond sound. In the newspapers, headlines spoke of a future of boundless prosperity, of interstate highways, civilian reactors, and supersonic planes. In the American imagination, progress was a national birthright. The press described the Soviets with condescension, steel imitators, tireless workers but incapable of innovation. Propaganda fed the idea that the USSR could only copy what the West had already done better. No one in Washington doubted that the next great step for humanity, the leap into space, would be American. Congressional committees talked about the final frontier, and headlines were adorned with the promise of rockets painted with the stars and stripes. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, reality was different. The Soviet Union was still scarring over the wounds of a war that had ravaged its territory. Millions dead, cities destroyed, factories reduced to ruins. Yet, from that devastation rose an iron will. In the years after 1945, Moscow rebuilt with a single purpose: to prove that socialism could not only match but surpass the West in the field where it believed itself invincible: science and technology. While in Washington, debates dissolved into budgets and military jurisdictions, in Moscow, the Politburo funneled limitless resources toward an almost symbolic goal: to look to the sky before anyone else. Soviet scientists worked under a simple slogan written in an internal Ministry of Industry report: "Whoever controls the height will control the future." At the beginning of 1956, American intelligence services detected unusual activity in the deserts of Kazakhstan. Reports from the Air Technical Intelligence Center mentioned the construction of a huge launch platform and the presence of an experimental rocket known as the R-7. Analysts judged it with skepticism. Too heavy, too costly, too inefficient. In the margins of the report, a general wrote by hand, "Nothing to fear from a missile that cannot lift off without a crane." The R-7, however, was something else. With a length of 30 meters and unprecedented power, it was the first truly intercontinental rocket. Born from military engineering, it was meant both to carry a nuclear warhead and eventually to place a satellite in orbit. In Baikonur, a name unknown then, a group of engineers led by an even more unknown man, Sergei Korolev, worked with an almost religious obsession. In Washington, agencies spoke in timelines and statistics. In Moscow, they worked with hunger and faith. American pride mistook limits for safety. Believing its scientific leadership eternal, the United States stopped looking up. And while generals slept soundly under the glow of their own lights somewhere in the eastern sky, the future began to be built in silence. In the 1950s, the space race did not begin with rockets, but with men. At one end of the world stood Sergei Korolev, a broad-faced, austere-eyed Soviet engineer who worked under the code name the Chief Designer. No one outside the Kremlin knew his identity. In official reports, not even his surname appeared. To the state, he was not a person, but a function. To his colleagues, a mind bordering on genius. Korolev had survived the Kolyma gulags, condemned during Stalin's purges for industrial sabotage. He spent 6 years in labor camps where he lost his teeth and part of his health, but what he did not lose was his obsession, the idea that humanity's future lay beyond the atmosphere. When he was rehabilitated in 1944, he returned to Moscow determined to turn his sentence into purpose. Prison had taught him that the state could destroy bodies, but also that it could move mountains when it chose to believe in something. And Korolev convinced the state to believe in the sky. His early projects with R-1 and R-5 missiles made him the central figure of Soviet space engineering. By 1956, he no longer thought of armament, but of transcendence. He wanted to prove that the Soviet Union could reach space first, not to destroy, but to demonstrate power without firing a single shot. In a Politburo meeting, while ministers debated whether to spend resources on a propaganda balloon, Korolev stood, placed a diagram of the R-7 rocket on the table, and spoke plainly. "We do not need words, comrades. Only facts." The silence that followed was his best argument. While decisions in Moscow were made in closed rooms, in Washington, science was argued in broad daylight. There, the key name was not an engineer, but a politician, James Killian, scientific advisor to President Eisenhower. Killian believed in a civil, international, transparent space program. "Space," he said, "must be an open laboratory, not a battlefield." But his voice competed with others, louder ones. The Air Force, the Navy, and the Army argued over who should control the orbital domain. Each branch claimed its own budget, its own scientists, and its own rocket. Meetings on Capitol Hill were endless, committees tangled in rivalries and egos. The military saw the sky as an extension of territory, scientists as a frontier for cooperation. Between them, Eisenhower tried to maintain political balance. He feared that a militarized program would provoke the Soviets and trigger a diplomatic crisis. His strategy was clear: move slowly, without provocation. But in the real world, speed was power. While in the United States reports piled up on Pentagon desks, in the Soviet Union, technicians assembled parts in improvised hangars, working 16 hours a day, driven by the certainty that every second lost could cost them glory. Two visions of the sky, two languages of progress. In Moscow, the silence of work. In Washington, the noise of committees. On May 15, 1957, Korolev wrote a note to his deputy, Tikhonravov. "The Americans talk about space. We are going to inhabit it." That sentence defined the difference between the two worlds. While American bureaucracy fine-tuned speeches, the Soviet Union prepared to launch a sound, a beeping that would not be a threat, but a declaration. The sky no longer belongs to them. In 1955, President Eisenhower officially approved the creation of the first American satellite program. They named it Project Vanguard, a name that evoked leadership and modernity. But from the start, that program was born amid disputes and egos. The United States Navy, determined to prove its relevance in the new age of rockets, prevailed over the Air Force and the Army to run the operation. Civilian scientists, led by the Naval Research Laboratory, promised the project would be a symbol of transparency before the world. A scientific satellite, open, non-military, launched in the name of humanity. In Washington offices, the idea sounded perfect. The political message was clear. Space would be a territory of peace. But in Pentagon language, peace meant weakness. Generals distrusted the civilian approach. "The Russians do not publish their experiments in scientific journals," they muttered, "and we're going to send press releases before launching rockets." To the military, bureaucratic slowness was almost a strategic insult. Even so, the White House stuck to its decision. Eisenhower feared a militarized space program could be read by the Soviet Union as a provocation, and he was determined to avoid a new arms race. "Space must serve science, not war," he insisted at each National Security Council meeting. But that prudence, in a world moving to the rhythm of fear, would cost them the lead. In Navy laboratories, Vanguard advanced with the solemnity of an academic thesis. Engineers wrestled with one problem after another: turbines that would not start, valves that froze, propellants that decomposed mid-test. Test rockets disintegrated in the air or tilted seconds after launch. Technicians recorded each failure with the meticulousness of scientists, not the urgency of soldiers. And while committees asked for more time, the calendar in Moscow grew shorter. The CIA, through its observation networks, began sending unsettling reports. In Kazakhstan, unusual activity appeared: rail convoys with large cylindrical structures, new tracking antennas, towers rising from the desert. "Probably missile test infrastructure," the report said. No one in Washington took it very seriously. The document was filed under the routine intelligence seal. In November 1956, Vanguard carried out its first suborbital test flight. The rocket climbed only a few kilometers before exploding over the Atlantic. Fragments rained into the sea, lighting the night with blue flashes. In the control room, engineers stood in silence as the cloud of fuel burned on the horizon. An observer from the Department of Defense jotted in his notebook, "Slow but promising progress." The contrast with the USSR was total. There, failures were secret and successes absolute. Every explosion at Baikonur was buried under a mountain of secrecy. Every achievement became a symbol of collective triumph. In the United States, each failed attempt was a photograph in the newspapers. In the Pentagon's conference rooms, tensions grew. The Air Force pressed to take control of the program and use the new Atlas missiles, capable of launching heavier payloads. But Eisenhower stood firm. Space had to remain civilian. That decision, noble in intent, would prove tragically naive. One day in December 1956, during a routine meeting, a general with his jacket unbuttoned and a cigarette between his fingers summed up the common thinking with a confident smile. "The Russians won't get there first. They cannot even feed their people." In that sentence lay the arrogance of a nation. And while American engineers repaired valves, on the other side of the planet, a giant rocket waited its turn beneath the snow of the Kazakh desert. Moscow, summer of 1957. The air was thick with humid heat, and the offices of Scientific Research Institute No. 88, on the outskirts of the city, smelled of metal and scorched paper. In a windowless room, Sergei Korolev reviewed the latest Soviet intelligence reports. The documents, brought directly from the embassy in Washington, spoke of Project Vanguard and its upcoming launches. The Americans planned to place their first satellite in orbit before the end of the year. Korolev read the report twice in silence, then set it on the table. He knew what it meant. Time, his oldest enemy, had just returned. He called his team that very night. Engineers, technicians, mathematicians, exhausted men who had spent years working on the R-7 rocket. On the chalkboard, Korolev drew a small circle, little more than a smudge of chalk. "This," he said, "will be our satellite, nothing more." A murmur rose. Some had expected something far more ambitious: orbital laboratories, cameras, scientific sensors. But he shook his head. "There's no time for ornaments. The first satellite must be simple, and it must speak." A young engineer, still in a rumpled uniform from the previous shift, raised his hand. "What will that voice say, comrade engineer?" Korolev paused, staring at the chalk circle. Then he smiled with a calm that belied the fatigue in his face. "It will say they are no longer alone in the sky." The idea was as bold as it was elegant. The satellite would carry no cameras and no measuring instruments, only a radio transmitter capable of emitting a continuous beep. That sound, monotonous, simple, unmistakable, would be proof that a Soviet object was orbiting the Earth. It would be enough just to hear it to understand. The project was approved under the code name PS-1, Prostashi Sputnik, Simple Satellite. But for Korolev, and for the few who knew of its existence, the name held another meaning. Sputnik meant traveling companion. It was a symbol, not of dominion, but of presence, the first human object to accompany the Earth in its journey around the sun. Engineers began to work with near-obsessive precision. Every screw was checked, every circuit hand-soldered. The body of the satellite would be a polished aluminum sphere barely 80 centimeters in diameter. Inside, a 1-watt transmitter and 2 chemical batteries capable of sustaining the signal for 3 weeks. On its surface, 4 curved antennas like the legs of an insect, designed to send the beeping in all directions of space. In parallel, the launch team at Baikonur prepared the R-7 rocket for a new mission. Conceived to carry a nuclear warhead, the missile would be adapted to lift that sphere into space. It was a perfect paradox. The most destructive weapon ever created by man would become the ladder to the stars. Over the following weeks, Korolev barely slept. He supervised assembly, reviewed orbital calculations, and corrected by hand the blueprints of each component. His stern manner intimidated everyone, but his vision kept the team united. In brief moments of rest, he walked the outer corridor of the laboratory, smoking cigarettes he rarely finished. He knew history would not remember failed attempts, only the first. One afternoon, as he watched them place the satellite on its stand, an engineer murmured, "It does not look like much, comrade." Korolev looked at him without raising his voice. Neither did the Wright brothers' first plane. The satellite was packed in a wooden crate and shipped by train to the cosmodrome. In official documents, it appeared as atmospheric measurement equipment. No one outside the tightest circle knew its true purpose. In the days that followed, while congressional committees in Washington debated budgets, and Project Vanguard kept accumulating delays, in a remote base in the Kazakh desert, a small metallic object waited beneath a gray tarp. It was Sputnik, the traveling companion of all humanity, and it was ready to speak. The Baikonur Cosmodrome was a place that appeared on no map, an endless expanse of Kazakh desert where the horizon vanished into a line of dust and silence. Temperatures swung between unbearable daytime heat and a cutting nighttime cold. At first glance, it was a dead landscape, yet beneath that cracked earth, the heart of the future was being built. There, surrounded by wooden barracks, makeshift hangars, and metal towers, glittering under the sun, the R-7 Semyorka rocket, the largest the world had ever seen, was assembled. 30 meters tall, more than 200 tons in weight, 4 main engines, and a power that exceeded any known missile. It was born as a weapon. Its initial purpose was to launch a nuclear warhead over North America. But Sergei Korolev had turned it into something different. Where others saw a vector of destruction, he saw a staircase. "A rocket does not know what it carries," he would say. "It only knows how to rise." The first tests were a catalog of disaster. Engineers worked without rest, with borrowed tools, low-grade materials, and crumbling infrastructure. Engines blew before reaching the required thrust. Valves froze mid-ignition. Fuel tanks warped in the summer heat. Some days, the desert floor was covered in charred debris, and technicians emerged from shelters caked in dust, jotting figures in their notebooks without raising their voices. Korolev slept little and spoke less. Sometimes he walked the test site with his hands clasped behind his back, listening to technical briefings as if taking the pulse of a dying patient. His authority was absolute, but he did not need to shout to wield it. Everyone knew that behind his serenity was a constant tension, an invisible clock marking the seconds between failure and glory. Orbital calculations were checked again and again. Mathematicians worked at night, their desk lamps turned into small beacons in the desert. Soldiers in charge of security did not know exactly what they were guarding, but they sensed it was immense. On May 15, 1957, the R-7 made its first attempt at a full flight. The rocket rose slowly, roaring at the sky, but at 90 seconds, the control system lost stability. Flames engulfed the structure, and fragments fell over the step. Korolev did not move. He only asked them to stop the chronometers. "Analyze the data," he said softly. "We will try again." For weeks, failure was routine. In the reports, the words structural failure, incomplete ignition, and trajectory deviation repeated like a litany. Yet every error brought them a little closer to success. Every explosion was an experiment, every loss a lesson. Finally, on August 21, 1957, after months of adjustments and sleepless nights, the R-7 lifted cleanly. The engine's roar made the earth tremble. The column of fire climbed until it vanished into blue. 2 minutes later, monitors confirmed the impossible. The first stage had separated successfully, then the second. At 22 minutes, the rocket signal was still active. The flight had been completed. Technicians broke into restrained applause. Some wept without knowing why. Motionless, Korolev watched the radar graphs. Then he took his leather notebook and wrote a single sentence. "Now we can reach any point on the planet." No one knew it yet, but that same rocket, conceived as a weapon, tested as a miracle, would become Sputnik's vehicle. The satellite launch was scheduled for October 1957. Korolev returned to Moscow with the expression of a man carrying a secret the world could not yet comprehend. In his briefcase, he carried a notebook, and in it, the calculations that would open the door to the sky. October 4th, 1957, 10:28 p.m., Moscow time. The Baikonur Desert breathes a dry, metallic air, cut by a wind that lifts dust and silence. On launch pad number 1, the R-7 Colossus rises under a moonless sky. Around it, floodlights paint white the fuel tanks, cables, and the long shadows of technicians running back and forth, murmuring numbers. Inside the control bunker, Sergei Korolev watches the clock. He holds his cap in his hand, eyes fixed on the communications panel. Sweat traces his forehead, though the air conditioning hums. At his side, operators run through checklists in tense voices. The words sound coded, rhythmic, almost ritual. Oxygen pressure nominal, chamber temperature stable, self-destruct inactive. The silence after each report seems to last an eternity. Outside, the countdown echoes through the loudspeakers. 10, 9, 8. The engine's roar cuts the night, a deep, ancient, almost animal sound. The support towers pull away. The ground shakes. A cloud of fire and vapor envelops the base. 3, 2, 1. The R-7 begins to move, slowly at first as if unsure, then decisively, leaving behind a column of fire that lights the desert. Outside, technicians look up with hands in their pockets, blinded by the light. One of them murmurs. It is as if the Earth does not want to let it go. The rocket climbs, tilts eastward, and disappears into low horizon cloud. In the control center, the engine noise dissolves into a distant hum. Screens flicker, no one speaks. Only the echo of instruments fills the room. 30 seconds pass, a minute, 2. An engineer breaks the silence. First stage separated. The murmur of relief is brief. The worst is yet to come. At 6 minutes of flight, the second stage remains stable. Calculations indicate that, if all holds, the satellite will reach orbit in less than 3 minutes. But the monitors are blank. No confirmation, no signal, only waiting. In Kamchatka, thousands of kilometers away, operators at the tracking station lean over receivers tuned to the assigned frequency. A man takes off his headphones, wipes them on his sleeve, and puts them back on. Suddenly, he hears something. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. Beep, beep, beep. "We have signal," he shouts, and the voice travels by direct line to Moscow. In the control bunker, Korolev closes his eyes and grips the handset with both hands. The signal booms in his ear. Rhythmic, precise, alive. There are no cheers, no one shouts. Only the beeping fills the room, as if it were the Earth's pulse. "It works," Korolev whispers, barely audible. For an instant, the men of Baikonur are not aware of what they have done. They do not think of flags or ideologies. They feel only the vertigo of having crossed an invisible boundary. For the first time in history, an object made by human hands circles the planet. Up there, 300 kilometers high, a metal sphere the size of a beach ball begins its journey. It reflects the dawn light over Siberia and sends its message into the void. Beep, beep, beep. No one can see it yet, but its voice already belongs to the world. On that cold desert night, humanity became, unknowingly, a species that had learned to leave footprints in the sky. In the early hours of October 5th, 1957, while Baikonur crews were still cleaning fuel residue from the pad, the Western Hemisphere awoke to a sound that did not come from Earth. In a small Illinois radio station, a deep-voiced announcer interrupted his usual program of light music. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in disbelief, "what you are hearing right now is not interference. It is a signal sent from outer space by the Soviet Union." In the background, the microphone picked up a metallic beeping, repeated, constant. Beep, beep, beep. The sound traveled over the airwaves and crossed the continent. Within minutes, it was retransmitted by dozens of stations. Thousands of American homes heard from their kitchen radios the echo of something no human ear had ever heard before, the voice of a human object orbiting overhead. Amateur astronomers went outside that very night with binoculars and improvised cameras. In the clear skies of Arizona, Kansas, and California, a luminous point crossed the firmament slowly. It did not shine more than a star, but it moved with mathematical precision, crossing the sky every 96 minutes. It was not a meteor. It was not a plane. It was Sputnik. The next day's papers printed headlines that would change the language of power. The Russians launched the first artificial satellite. The red space. Moscow conquers the sky. In newsrooms, editors did not know whether to place the story in the science section or the defense pages. The military brass did know. It was both. In Washington, the Pentagon called an emergency session. In the main room, officers studied photos of the satellite and copies of trajectories calculated by civilian observatories. The Secretary of Defense tried to keep his composure. "A satellite that transmits a signal, nothing more," he said. But no one believed it. Strategists immediately understood the implication. If a Soviet satellite could fly over the United States, so could their missiles. The sky, until then considered the nation's natural shield, had become its greatest vulnerability. Generals looked at one another in silence. There was a mix of disbelief and humiliation. For years, they had assured that the Soviets were decades behind in technological development. And now, while they argued among themselves, Sputnik's beeping sounded in every radio, every laboratory, every university in the world. A young, pale-faced colonel broke the silence with a sentence no one wanted to repeat out loud. "They beat us with a metal ball." That ball of 83 kilograms had done more than any bomb. It had pierced the invisible wall of American pride. In a matter of hours, the confidence that had supported the nation since Hiroshima crumbled. Americans realized that the enemy had not only caught up, it was watching from above. Meanwhile, in the world's skies, Sputnik kept circling. Every 96 minutes, its metallic voice crossed the air, immutable, almost mocking. Beep, beep, beep. The sound that woke the entire planet had no melody, no words, no threat. But within it, something deeper could be heard. The confirmation that the sky no longer belonged to anyone, and that history had slipped silently into space. In Moscow, the morning of October 5th, 1957 dawned different. The air was cold, but in the streets there was a warmth that did not come from the sun. Newspapers sold out in the first hours. On Pravda's front page, the headline filled the entire sheet: "The genius of the Soviet people has opened the road to the stars." Below, a photograph showed the small spherical satellite with its antennas extended, floating over a black background. It was more than a scientific achievement, it was a proclamation of faith. Radio stations repeated the news without rest. In factories, schools, and squares, Sputnik's beeping was broadcast over loudspeakers. Workers looked up as if they could see it crossing the sky. Children drew rockets in their notebooks. For Soviet propaganda, it was not only a technological victory, but a moral one. The message was simple and devastating. Socialism had reached space before capitalism. Korolev, watching the celebrations from his office window, remained silent. He knew that behind each applause were years of hunger, fear, and sacrifice. He knew success was as fragile as the metal circling the planet, but for an instant, he let the euphoria in. They had done it. Meanwhile, outside the communist bloc, the echo of the news took on another tone. In London, analysts at the Ministry of Defense met urgently. In Paris, newspapers spoke of a revolution in the sky, but in Washington, the most repeated word was fear. Civilian observatories confirmed that Sputnik completed an orbit every 96 minutes, passing over North America, Europe, and the Pacific. The simple existence of a Soviet satellite meant that Moscow could send objects into space, and that, in theory, it could make them fall on any point of the planet. In Pentagon offices, the world map took on a new meaning. Borderlines no longer mattered. Space, previously considered a Udimap void, had become an open highway above all nations. The sky, the same sky that for decades had symbolized freedom, began to feel like a vulnerable ceiling. America's allies demanded answers. In London, a British parliamentarian declared, "If they can put a satellite in orbit, they can place a bomb over New York, London, or Berlin." In Tokyo, headlines asked, "Who controls the sky?" And in Washington, congressmen turned on one another in search of culprits. Eisenhower, outwardly calm, summoned his scientific advisors. His concern was not only military, it was psychological. "The problem," he said, "is that the enemy has shown it can dream faster than we can." American newsrooms filled with editorials mixing admiration and alarm. The New York Times published a line that summarized the collective feeling: "Man has touched the stars, and he has done it with a Russian accent." Within days, Sputnik's beeping stopped, sounding like a scientific curiosity, and became a constant reminder. Each time it crossed the night sky, radars tracked it, astronomers photographed it, and millions of people watched from their yards, wondering whether that point of light was a promise or a threat. In Moscow, they celebrated it as a dawn. In Washington, they saw it as a shadow. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, had become a territory of fear. And in barely 24 hours, the Cold War had ceased to be earthbound. Sputnik's impact was immediate. In the United States, the satellite's beeping became a symbol of national shame. In a country used to dominating every realm of science, the idea that the Russians had reached space first stung harder than any bomb. Headlines spoke of the day America lost the sky. Cartoons showed Uncle Sam looking up, frightened, while a tiny red dot orbited over his head. On campuses, students debated the fall of technological pride. In homes, parents listened to the news in disbelief. The sense of security that had defined the post-war era crumbled. If the Soviets could put something in orbit, they could also launch something from it. Space, which had been an abstract territory, turned tangible, threatening, real. Eisenhower understood that speeches would not suffice. In November 1957, he gathered his advisors in the Oval Office. The reports were clear. The Soviet Union had won the first battle of space. The response had to be total, not a military reprisal, but a scientific revolution. "We cannot allow the next century to begin in Russian," he said. The decision was immediate. The president ordered the creation of a unified space agency to concentrate the scattered efforts of the armed forces, universities, and civilian industry. Thus, in July 1958, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was born. Its founding decree contained a sentence that captured the new American spirit. Where there is space, there will be competition. And where there is competition, there will be progress. But Eisenhower knew the problem was not only technology, it was knowledge. Sputnik had shown that Soviet education produced engineers capable of surpassing their American peers. In response, Congress passed one of the most consequential laws of the 20th century, the National Defense Education Act. For the first time, the federal government poured billions of dollars into teaching mathematics, physics, chemistry, and engineering. Scholarships, laboratories, and research programs were created. Science became a matter of national security. Meanwhile, in secret labs and bases, engineers worked quietly on a new generation of satellites. They were not civilian scientists or space dreamers. They were men of the Pentagon. The Discoverer and Corona projects, camouflaged as scientific missions, were in fact the first attempts to build reconnaissance satellites capable of photographing Soviet military installations from orbit. In nameless hangars in California and Utah, cameras were developed that could distinguish an aircraft on a runway from hundreds of kilometers up. Each of those programs sprang from the same impulse that had launched Sputnik, the need to see. The difference was that now the United States no longer looked upward with hubris, but with urgency. Humiliation had turned into a fuel more powerful than liquid kerosene. For the first time since Hiroshima, Americans feared the sky, and that fear became motion. The newspapers that a week earlier had spoken of defeat now wrote about a new race. The entire country re-educated itself to reach everything: knowledge, space, the future. The era of complacency had ended. Sputnik had awakened a nation, and as so often in history, fear turned into drive. Sputnik's launch changed the nature of the Cold War forever. What, until 1957, had been a competition for territories, armies, and nuclear weapons, suddenly became a race for something much bigger: the future. The sky, once empty, became a symbolic battlefield where every orbit, every mission, and every fragment of metal meant power, prestige, and survival. The Soviet Union had conquered the first rung, but for both sides, that achievement was only the beginning. Space was no longer a scientific dream or a philosophical promise. It was a tool of political power. The rockets that could launch satellites could also launch weapons. The radars that tracked stars could watch enemies, and each step toward the cosmos was, at heart, another step deeper into the war. In Moscow, Sergei Korolev kept working in silence, as always. Under his direction, the Soviet team designed a capsule that would bear the name Vostok. 4 years after Sputnik, on April 12, 1961, the same R-7 rocket that had placed that metal sphere in orbit launched the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. His voice, transmitted by radio, resonated in millions of homes. The Earth is blue. For the Kremlin, it was the definitive victory. For the world, a revelation. For the first time in history, a human had seen the entire planet with his own eyes. Sputnik's echo became a new melody, that of a civilization beginning to understand its smallness. In the United States, the response was immediate. In January 1958, scarcely 3 months after Sputnik, the Americans launched their own satellite, Explorer 1. It was a modest technical success, but politically and morally crucial. It showed that the country could recover, that defeat was not permanent. From there, progress was dizzying. Project Mercury, then Gemini, and finally Apollo, the program that would take man to the moon. Yet even at the most glorious moment of that race, July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong set foot on lunar dust, Sputnik's echo still lingered. The engineers who had worked night and day to fulfill Kennedy's promise remembered that first metallic, repetitive, almost childlike signal. That sound had been the trigger for everything. One night in a laboratory in Huntsville, Alabama, As they dismantled equipment after the Apollo 11 mission, two veteran engineers stood gazing at an old radio receiver kept as a memento. One, gray-haired, asked, "Why did we run so hard?" The other smiled, lighting a cigarette. "Because one day we heard a beeping that made us look up." Sputnik had vanished years earlier, burned on re-entry, but its message kept orbiting in the minds of all who had heard it. It had been the spark that lit a new era. From that beeping on, humanity understood that the sky was not the limit, but the beginning, and that, in the history of civilization, sometimes a single sound is enough to wake an entire planet. We return to 1957. The sky over the planet is still dark, but in that darkness, there's a sound that does not belong to Earth. 300 kilometers up, a small metal sphere, barely 80 centimeters across, continues its journey around the world, sending its signal every 0.3 seconds. Beep, beep, beep. That cold, mechanical voice crosses the planet's nights. It is heard in radio stations, in laboratories, in basements full of improvised antennas. Each beep is a simple, powerful affirmation. The human being has left a mark beyond the atmosphere. In Moscow, Sergei Korolev contemplates a model of the satellite in his office. He is exhausted, but he does not smile. He knows that what began as a secret project has become a symbol for all humanity. Sputnik carries no weapons and no cameras, and it is not a threat. It is a voice that says into the void, "We are here." On the other side of the world, in Washington, Pentagon generals and scientists listen to the recording of the beeping with tight lips. No translation is needed. They understand its meaning. It is the confirmation that the sky no longer belongs to anyone, that the ultimate frontier has shifted upward. Space, which until that night had been synonymous with freedom, now belongs to everyone and to no one at the same time. The world has changed. Borders are no longer drawn with maps, but with orbits. Power is no longer measured in armies, but in altitude. And yet, in that monumental change, there is something deeply human. Sputnik does not threaten, does not watch, does not conquer. It only speaks. And its message, repeated again and again at a frequency of 20 megahertz, is not a war cry nor a political proclamation. It is a statement of existence. We are here. Korolev switches off the lights in his office and looks at the model's reflection in the window glass. He does not know how long that little satellite will last before it falls, but he understands that as long as its signal lives, the whole planet will be listening. In the Kremlin's silence, the last echo of the metallic beeping sounds. Beep, beep, beep. Within those intervals lies everything: the fear, the ambition, the curiosity, and the hope of a species that has just discovered its home is smaller than it thought. The sky had ceased to be a symbol of dominion. It had become a frontier. And for the first time, humanity understood that looking up was also looking toward the future.